What if I told you that one of the greatest identity thefts in human history happened not with a gun, not with fire, but with a pen, a theory, and a publishing house in London? And what if I told you that millions of people right now are walking around without their real history because a group of 19th century scholars sat down, invented an entire race that never biologically existed, and used it to quietly erase one of the oldest identities on Earth from the history books? Not a conspiracy theory, not a legend. Documented, published, cited in universities for over 100 years. This is the story of the Hamitic hypothesis, the most successful academic identity heist ever pulled off in modern history. And today, we are going to follow the paper trail, name by name, year by year. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at an African history textbook the same way again. Let's start at the beginning. The mid-1800s, Europe is in the middle of what they called the scramble for Africa. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, all racing to carve up an entire continent. And there is a problem they did not anticipate. The problem is this: everywhere European explorers go in Africa, they find evidence of sophisticated civilization, architecture, trade networks, written records, legal codes. This does not fit the story they are trying to tell, the story that Africa is a dark continent, primitive, uncivilized, ready to be governed by outsiders. So what do you do when the evidence contradicts your narrative? You don't hide the evidence. That would be too obvious. You do something far smarter. You reinterpret it. You create a category, a group, an in-between people that is neither fully African nor European, and you attribute every sign of African genius to them. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the birth of the Hamitic hypothesis. The Hamitic hypothesis was a formal academic theory developed and refined throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries that argued the following. Any advanced civilization found in Africa, any pyramid, any kingdom, any sophisticated legal system, any evidence of biblical-era culture was not created by indigenous black African people. Instead, it was created by a supposedly distinct group called Hamites, described as lighter-skinned, with supposedly more Caucasian features, who migrated into Africa from somewhere outside, usually theorized as the Middle East or Northeast Africa. And here is the key part that most people miss. These Hamites were explicitly linked in early scholarship to the biblical Table of Nations, specifically to Ham, one of the sons of Noah. Think about what that means. By controlling the identity of Ham and his descendants, scholars could control who got credited with biblical-era civilization in Africa. They could decide who was Israelite, who was Canaanite, who was Egyptian, who was connected to the ancient world of Scripture, and who was not. This was not just anthropology. This was a theological and historical power move, dressed up in the language of science. And the question I want you to sit with is this: if a group of scholars could invent a race on paper, what else could they rewrite? Now, let's talk about the specific individuals who built this theory, because history without names is just noise. The roots of what would become the Hamitic hypothesis stretched back to early 19th century travel literature and ethnography. Writers like James Cowles Pritchard, whose 1813 work researches into the physical history of man, began laying early groundwork for race-based categorizations of African peoples. Pritchard himself had complex, sometimes contradictory views, but his framework of categorizing African groups by physical traits and supposed origins set the stage for what came next. By the 1860s and 1870s, scholars and explorers like John Hanning Speke, the British explorer famous for the search for the source of the Nile, were making extraordinary claims in popular publications. Speke's 1863 work, Journal of the Discovery of the Source of the Nile, contained a now infamous argument about the kingdoms of Buganda and surrounding regions, essentially claiming that any organized governance or cultural sophistication he observed must have come from a foreign, lighter-skinned people who entered from the north. Speke was not a trained anthropologist, he was an explorer with an ideology. But his books sold, his ideas spread, and the Hamitic framework began to calcify into something that looked, on the surface, like established science. Now here's where it gets really specific, and this is the document you need to know about. In 1930, C.G. Seligman, a British anthropologist, fellow of the Royal Society, published a book called Races of Africa. This book became one of the most widely assigned texts in African studies courses across British and American universities for decades. And in it, Seligman argued that the civilizations of Africa are the civilizations of the Hamites, describing them as a branch of the Mediterranean race, who are, in his framing, essentially Europeans who had migrated southward into the continent. A Fellow of the Royal Society, a book published by Oxford University, assigned in universities, saying that African civilizations were made by people who were essentially transplanted Europeans. This is not fringe thinking, this is the mainstream. And here is the question for the comments. If this was taught in universities as established fact for decades, what else in the textbooks do we need to go back and audit? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. Understanding that the theory existed is one thing. Understanding exactly how it erased Israelite identity from the African historical record, that requires us to follow the logic step by step. Here is the mechanism. Step 1. Any ancient population in Africa that shows evidence of cultural sophistication, architectural achievement, or connection to Near Eastern civilizations gets labeled Hamitic by the scholar. Step 2. The Hamites are defined as a separate, non-black, foreign origin group, so by definition, credit goes away from indigenous African peoples. Step 3. Any community in Africa that carries oral traditions, cultural practices, or physical markers connecting them to ancient Hebrew or Israelite identity gets absorbed into this same Hamite category. They are reclassified, rebranded. And the devastating result is this: the Israelite identity, which historical and textual evidence suggests had an African dimension, gets filed under a made-up category and disappears from the conversation entirely. You are left with a map that has no Israelites in Africa, a history that has no black ancient Near Eastern peoples, and a biblical narrative that looks suspiciously like it has been scrubbed clean of an entire demographic. This is what scholars today call historiographical violence, the act of erasing a people not by destroying their artifacts, but by reinterpreting those artifacts as belonging to someone else. The Hamitic hypothesis was the instrument of that erasure. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, this is one book, one theory, one era. But the scope of this framework's influence was enormous. The Hamitic hypothesis was used to explain the origins of ancient Egypt's ruling classes, the builders of Great Zimbabwe, the massive stone city in southern Africa, the founders of the Kushite kingdoms, the roots of the Tutsi people in Rwanda, a categorization that, according to multiple historians, contributed directly to the racial ideology that fueled the Rwandan genocide in 1994. That last point deserves to be said clearly. A 19th century academic theory about a fictional superior Hamitic race was used by Belgian colonial authorities to elevate Tutsi over Hutu on racial grounds, and the legacy of that fabricated racial hierarchy contributed to a genocide that killed between 500,000 and 800,000 people. The Hamitic hypothesis was not a harmless academic exercise. It had blood on its pages, and the scholars who promoted it Seligman, and before him writers like Harry Johnston, whose 1913 work, The Negro in the New World, expanded Hamitic arguments across the Atlantic, were not marginal voices. They were the establishment. So when someone says this is just a theory from 100 years ago, ask them how many textbooks it shaped, how many policies it justified, how many identities it erased. Leave that in the comments because the answer is not settled. Now this is the part where the documentary turns, because the Hamitic hypothesis was not just morally wrong, it was historically and textually wrong, and we can prove it. Let's start with the biblical text itself, because the scholars who used Scripture to build the Hamitic framework were, in many cases, misreading or selectively reading that very Scripture. In the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, the descendants of Ham are listed as Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Biblical scholars and linguists, not fringe voices, mainstream academics, have identified Cush as corresponding to regions of ancient Nubia and Sudan, Mizraim as the Hebrew word for Egypt, and Put as corresponding to regions of Libya or the Horn of Africa. These are not light-skinned foreigners who migrated into Africa. These are indigenous African peoples in the text, by name. The Hamitic hypothesis required scholars to take the biblical sons of Ham, people the text places in Africa, and redefine them as a separate non-African people who then entered Africa from outside. They inverted the text to serve the theory. The biblical record, read plainly, does not support a division between Africans and Hamites. The Hamites are the Africans in the Genesis genealogy. The split was manufactured. And then there is the question of the Israelites themselves. Multiple books of the Hebrew Bible describe the Israelites spending extended time in Egypt and Cush. They intermarried, they integrated. They were, by any modern understanding of the ancient Near East, a people of African and Semitic overlap. Moses himself, in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, is described as having married a Cushite woman. When Miriam and Aaron criticize this marriage, they are struck with judgment. The text treats this marriage as legitimate. It treats the Cushite woman as part of the community, and yet the Hamitic hypothesis would place Cushites in a different racial category entirely separate from Israelites, a separation the text itself never makes. Beyond Scripture, the physical archaeological record also pushes back hard against the Hamitic framework. Take the case of Great Zimbabwe, the massive stone city in southern Africa, built without mortar, featuring walls over 11 meters high, dating to between the 11th and 15th centuries. When European explorer Karl Mach arrived there in 1871, he literally refused to believe it was built by local African peoples. He proposed it was built by Phoenicians, foreigners, outsiders, people who fit the Hamitic external civilizer template. Subsequent colonial-era archaeologists were instructed, and this is documented, not to publish findings that confirmed indigenous African authorship. David Randall McIver, in 1905, conducted proper excavations and concluded clearly that Great Zimbabwe was built by ancestors of the local Shona people. He was largely ignored for decades. The Hamitic foreign builder narrative was simply too useful to abandon. By the 1970s, under Ian Smith's Rhodesian government, it was actually illegal to publish or promote the view that Great Zimbabwe was built by black Africans. Think about that. A government made it illegal to tell the truth about who built a historical monument. This is what the Hamitic hypothesis made possible. Not just bad scholarship, but the legal suppression of correct scholarship. And if you think this kind of documented suppression happens somewhere else too, drop the name in the comments. That is the kind of research this channel lives for. The Hamitic hypothesis did not last forever unchallenged. By the mid-20th century, African scholars, and eventually Western scholars as well, began systematically dismantling it. One of the most important voices was Sheikh Anta Diop, a Senegalese historian, anthropologist, and physicist whose 1954 work Nation Negra et Culture, translated as African Origin of Civilization, made a systematic scholarly case that ancient Egyptian civilization was founded by and primarily developed by Black African peoples. Diop was not initially welcomed by the European academic establishment. His doctoral thesis was rejected multiple times. He was marginalized. But the evidence he compiled, linguistic analysis, melanin dosage analysis of royal mummies, cultural continuity studies, osteological analysis, was serious scholarship, and over decades it could not be ignored. By 1974, UNESCO organized the Cairo Symposium, a formal academic conference bringing together leading Egyptologists from around the world to debate the question of ancient Egyptian origins. The outcome was significant. Multiple scholars concluded that the racial categorization of ancient Egyptians as Hamitic or Proto-Caucasian was not supported by the physical evidence. The Hamitic hypothesis, at least in its most extreme form, was quietly retired from formal Egyptology by the 1980s. But here's the problem. Just because a theory is retired in academic journals does not mean it disappears from textbooks, from public consciousness, or from the downstream assumptions that shape how we interpret African history today. The framework was removed from the top shelf, but its influence stayed in the walls. Here is what I want you to understand about why this matters beyond just academic history. The Hamitic hypothesis was not only an anthropological theory, it was a theological operation. By controlling who counted as Hamite and who counted as Semite, by drawing that line inside Africa, scholars were simultaneously controlling who had a claim to Israelite identity. Who could read Deuteronomy as speaking to their ancestors? Who belonged inside the biblical story? Who was an outsider looking in? If the Israelites who were scattered, as described in multiple prophetic books, ended up in Africa, and if African peoples carry cultural, linguistic, and genetic markers consistent with ancient Near Eastern origin, then the Hamitic hypothesis served as the academic mechanism to say, no, any connection you see is a Hamite connection, not an Israelite one. The identity is rerouted. The claim is nullified. The displacement becomes invisible. This is why the theory was so durable. It was not just explaining history, it was managing identity claims. It was deciding in advance who could read the Bible as their own story. And the evidence, the textual evidence, the archaeological evidence, the Human Genome Project that has emerged since the Human Genome Project increasingly suggests that these identity walls were artificial, that the separation between African and Israelite and Hamite that 19th century scholars drew in ink was never written in DNA. Now, I want to be careful here because the genetics of ancient populations is genuinely complex, and responsible scholars do not make sweeping claims without nuance. But here is what we can say with confidence based on published research in peer-reviewed journals. Ancient DNA studies of Egyptian royal mummies, including the 2017 study published in Nature Communications, confirmed complex population mixing in ancient Egypt with connections to both African and Near Eastern populations. This is not the Proto-Caucasian Hamite that Seligman described in 1930. This is a population at the crossroads of Africa and the Near East, exactly what the biblical text would suggest about peoples like the Cushites, Mizraim, and their neighbors. Genetic studies of populations in the Horn of Africa, Sudan, and parts of West Africa have also revealed ancient connections to haplogroups associated with the ancient Levant, connections that predate the Atlantic slave trade by thousands of years. None of this proves a single sweeping narrative, but all of it contradicts the clean racial separation that the Hamitic hypothesis required. The DNA does not lie, but the frameworks used to interpret DNA, Those can be shaped by the same assumptions that shaped Seligman's pen in 1930. That is why framework literacy, knowing the history of ideas, matters as much as knowing the data itself. At this point in the story, I always get one question from the audience. Why? Why would scholars go to the trouble of inventing a race? Why not just ignore African history entirely? The answer is because you cannot ignore evidence that is sitting right in front of you. The monuments exist, the texts exist, the cities exist. The question is how you explain them. And in the context of colonial-era justification, there were two things that needed to be true simultaneously. One, Africa needed to appear primitive and in need of governance by outsiders. Two, African evidence of advanced civilization needed to be explained away without denying it existed. The Hamitic hypothesis solved those problems elegantly. It acknowledged the civilization, it just attributed it to a Proto-European group. The indigenous population remains passive. The civilizing force came from outside, and the Israelite identity, which would give African peoples a direct claim to one of the world's most significant spiritual and historical lineages, gets rerouted through the fictional Hamite category and vanishes. It was an elegant solution to a colonial problem, and it worked for a century. The question is whether it still works today, in subtler forms, in assumptions we have inherited without examining. What do you think? Have you ever been in a classroom where this framework, maybe without the name, was still quietly operating? Let me know in the comments. By the time academic institutions formally moved away from the Hamitic hypothesis, the damage was already layered into decades of published scholarship. Textbooks written in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, shaped by the Hamitic framework, were still being used in schools through the 1970s and 80s. Popular culture absorbed the assumptions without the label. Films, documentaries, museum exhibits, all inherited a default picture of ancient Africa that quietly placed the most sophisticated achievements in the hands of outsiders, while indigenous African peoples remained background figures. And the theological impact was perhaps the most lasting, because ordinary people, not academics, read the Bible through the lens of what they learned in school. If school taught them that African civilizations were Hamitic and foreign, then they read the biblical Hamites as foreign too. And the indigenous Israelite identity of African-descended peoples remained hidden in plain sight. This is the real cost of the Hamitic hypothesis. Not just bad anthropology, but 3 or 4 generations of people, particularly African Americans, Caribbean communities, and other African-descended peoples, who were systematically kept from connecting the dots between their oral traditions, their cultural memory, and the historical record. That is not an accident. That is architecture. But here is where the story shifts, because the last 20 years have seen something remarkable, a convergence of academic archaeology, genetics, and independent historical research that is slowly reconstructing what the Hamitic hypothesis obscured. African scholars working within and outside Western institutions are re-examining the primary sources, going back to the ancient texts in their original languages, looking at the DNA without the colonial framework imposed on top. Young researchers are publishing in peer-reviewed journals findings that would have been suppressed or ignored 50 years ago. And communities of African-descended peoples around the world are doing their own parallel research, comparing oral traditions to written records, checking cultural practices against archaeological timelines, asking the questions that formal institutions were slow to ask. This is not nostalgia, this is historiographical recovery, and it is happening in real time. The Hamitic hypothesis tried to close the door on a connection between African identity and ancient Near Eastern history. The evidence, patiently assembled decade by decade, is opening that door back up. So let's bring this back to the beginning. What was the Hamitic hypothesis? It was a formally published, academically endorsed framework advanced by named scholars like C.G. Seligman in 1930, built on earlier 19th century ethnographic assumptions by Pritchard and Speke in 1863, Oxford University Press, the Royal Society, UNESCO's 1974 Reckoning. This is not conspiracy, this is history. And history, when you actually read it, tells a very different story than most of us were taught in school. Now I want to hear from you. We traced the Hamitic hypothesis from its 19th century origins all the way to its academic decline and the shadow it still casts today. But this is only one piece of the evidence trail. So I want to ask you directly, what other historical frameworks or academic theories do you think were used to manipulate the record of African and Israelite history? What evidence have you found or heard about that you think deserves more investigation? Drop it in the comments. No wild speculation, just sources, dates, documents. That is how this community works. If this video opened a door for you, hit subscribe because we have more deep dives like this coming. The record is not settled, and we are just getting started.